Have you ever wondered what love does to a man? Well, apparently it's whatever the hell this is. Right, Vox? But for real though, how does one go from this to this? Let's just put it this way. It's complicated and sad, but it ultimately all comes down to Vox's fragile sense of ego and the inevitable maniacal downfall of a god complex that's gone awry. There's a lot to unpack here, so for starters, I wanted to highlight how his egomania made itself visibly known before Season 2 even began airing. What do I mean by this? Well, if we take a closer look at the key visual, it cleverly showcases how Vox effectively grabs hold of the narrative this season. He sees himself as the protagonist of the show by menacingly towering over both his greatest allies and foes, like a puppet master who's already envisioned how the story ends. Besides that, the image also conveys the power dynamic between him and the other V's, with Valentino being Vox's right-hand man and Velvette being equally as important, but they're still held under his grasp. In my eyes, even the colors paint a rather interesting picture about the characters and their dynamics, with the V's having an overall cohesive color palette, highlighting just how well they work in tandem. On the other hand, when it comes to his opponents, Vox's shades of blue and cyan heavily contrast with Charlie and Alastor's intense hues of red, while also overpowering the more subdued pastel tones of the Seraphim Angels. Next up, I'd also like to explore Charlie and Vox's shared sense of duality from this season, as they're both undeniably some of Hell's biggest dreamers. Even with that in mind, it's unlikely they'll be able to see things eye to eye anytime soon, considering their views on redemption are fundamentally incompatible. Also, Charlie being so authentically herself really bothers Vox, since he's the kind of guy who's obsessed with constantly upgrading his social mask to the latest version that's approved by the masses. Vox loathes Charlie's mission because her good intentions with the hotel are genuinely timeless and evergreen. She welcomes all souls, new or old, as long as they truly seek redemption, and Vox knows he can't compete with that kind of a message and offer. After all, he's a man who desperately clings to modernity and looks down on the ones who came before him. I mean, just look at how disrespectful he acts towards Zestial. His exclusionary philosophy gets further highlighted by the way the V-Tower operates. Only desirable souls are welcomed, with the rest being gatekept from ever joining the organization. The moment Vox smells fresh blood in the water, he'll sink his teeth straight through your soul and make sure you're the next big thing, as long as you're willing to cut out the parts of yourself that will never be good enough in the eyes of the public. But the moment you're seen as old news, not even his sharks will want to take a bite out of you anymore. Charlie is someone who wholeheartedly believes in the hotel's residents, while Vox only trusts himself to get the job done, which will only come to his detriment down the line. And speaking of Vox's self-centered nature, I find it quite clever how the show puts that greedy aspect of himself on full display. He quite literally steals the show whenever he breaks the fourth wall by going full screen mode for his audience. His grander-than-god egomania also gets perfectly showcased during his confrontation with Lucifer. Just like an infomercial, Vox sells himself as the solution to all of Hell's problems and justified grievances against heaven. Vox effectively broadcasts himself as Hell's self-appointed messiah and leader, a sinner for the sinners, unlike Lucifer, who's technically an angelic outcast, when in reality, he's a power-hungry monster who thinks that owning the narrative also gives him the God-given right to trample all over people's sense of autonomy without their consent. He's a conman in the truest sense of the word. After all, the term stands for confidence man, and that definition fits Vox to a T, or in his case, to a V. He can't fool everyone though, especially not someone like Alastor, who's dealt with plenty of showbiz industry sharks during his lifetime. Vox is someone who loves to plan things 10 steps ahead, but he made a serious miscalculation when he thought that him and Al could ever become partners in crime. They're both undeniably similar in many ways, but somehow they also manage to be polar opposites at the same time. You can think of them as a pair of magnets, where, in theory, they could form an unbreakable bond if they united their powers. But here's the thing though, that was never truly an option to begin with, since Alastor's views on Hell were always fundamentally incompatible with Vox's, which resulted in that catastrophic rejection when things got a bit too close for comfort. Vox's insincere trust us motto isn't exactly enticing to someone like Alastor, who trusts no one in Hell. Let's just say that Al learned that lesson the hard way after he made the mistake of entrusting Rosie with his own soul long ago. Plus, it doesn't help that Alastor thrives in the shadows and prefers to let his voice be the star of the show, as opposed to Vox, who loves to be permanently exposed in the spotlight. Overall, you know what's the saddest part about this brutal rejection? According to Viv herself in an interview, Vox was being genuinely vulnerable during this moment, by letting his guard down in ways that he couldn't when he was still alive. And she also mentions how this ties into his insecurities as a character. Maybe you're wondering, what exactly does she mean by this? Well, if we go back to the time when Vox was alive and still known as Vincent, the world was unfortunately much less accepting towards people who are seen as different. During the 1950s, when Vincent was trying to make a name for himself in the entertainment industry, he most likely had to hide the fact that he was a bisexual man. Even back then, Vincent was obsessed with gaining the approval of the masses, so he was most likely terrified of ever showcasing that part of himself to the public, since he knew it would probably lead to people rejecting him for who he is. With that additional context in mind, I think it's safe to say that it took a lot of courage for Vox to open up about his true feelings towards Alastor. But just like that, his worst fears of rejection became a reality, which seems to have broken him in many ways. This is why Vox is so obsessed with getting his petty revenge on Alastor, even decades after the fact. Another thing that caught my attention was the way in which Vox was willing to casually say stuff like, "People know us, they love us, we could rule hell together as partners." But after this incident occurred, it looks like he lost his ability to genuinely say things like that ever again, even around the other V's. This causes him to constantly slip up by making everything only about himself, his plans, and his accomplishments, which eventually becomes a major point of contention between the V's. Anyway, I'd like to put them aside for now, since there's still a lot that needs to be said about Vox's backstory during Brigther. As an appetizer, let's start with the fact that just like a shark, he's willing to cannibalize his own kind as long as it allows him to embody their star qualities. Not only does he steal their place in the spotlight, but also their very lives, by using their identities as stepping stones for his journey to the top. Whenever anyone gets in his way and prevents him from shining even brighter, the cycle repeats. Early into his career, he put on a mask to cover up the dissatisfaction he felt from being stuck at the bottom of the entertainment industry. This inner turmoil made him embark on a lifelong endeavor to become the so-called god of entertainment. He believes that evolving from one stage to another is only achievable by constantly changing up his self-image. He glamorizes death and treats it as the peak of human entertainment by broadcasting his carnage for all to see. This insatiable hunger for destruction eventually ends up devouring his own soul, with his mortal shell inevitably collapsing under the weight of his maniacal sense of ego. His endless need to shine brighter than anyone else is a compulsion. It's a disease that eats him up on the inside, just like a dark hole that's consuming his entire existence. This astronomical sense of greed gets highlighted by his grandiose delusions, with him saying things like, "The world's yours, go make the stars align." And then he perfectly sums up the culmination of this madness when he admits he's willing to go supernova, which is the phenomenon that occurs when a massive star reaches the end of its lifespan, resulting in a gigantic luminous explosion, which can also leave a black hole behind as an aftermath. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Vox effectively worships the light as if it were some kind of deity, for which he's willing to sacrifice everything. Nothing else matters as long as he gets the chance to shine brighter than any other star in the universe, even if it's just for a brief moment. In the end, Alastor actually said it best. "You'll never fill your cup, you're broken from the start, no victory will ever be enough." And speaking of victories, why is Vox so obsessed with proving the fact that he's actually a winner, rather than a sore loser? When Lucifer calls him garbage and a failure, it deeply upsets him for whatever reason. Also, why is he so desperate to become a god by conquering heaven when he's already one of the top dogs in hell? The truth is, all of these underlying questions are actually connected. He feels deeply insecure about the fact that he's a sinner, because that means he's automatically disqualified from being a winner in heaven. This is why he looks down on hell, since he considers it to be nothing more than a gigantic trash heap that's filled with a bunch of losers. Even after he reached the status of being hell's most powerful sinner, in his eyes, he'd still be ranked below any regular winner from heaven. He wants to get his revenge on heaven by overthrowing their god for daring to make the mistake of sending his soul to hell. Vox can't accept the fact that Vincent, the god of entertainment himself, and all his achievements on Earth ultimately meant nothing in the afterlife. He wants to fix that divine injustice by becoming the world's one and only true god. That way, he could recapture the pure bliss that he felt during the peak of his glory days on Earth, with the added bonus of finally being accepted into the technological utopia of his dreams. Except, none of that actually worked out for him, since he just ended up falling flat on his face instead, with all of his plans quickly crumbling behind him. He naively thought that he could simply discard the other V's as if they're easily disposable cogwheels from his multimedia machine. Big mistake, especially when Vox is the kind of man who lives and dies by his approval ratings. The moment he jumped the shark, he could no longer rely on Velvette to spin the narrative in his favor. And just like that, Valentino basically became the new face of Vox Tech overnight. In theory, his friends chose not to abandon him, but realistically speaking, it's going to be quite a shock to his system when it finally sinks in that he's officially entered his humble pad era. And who knows, he may even start to seriously reconsider his stance on redemption after everything that transpired. He's got nothing left to lose at this point.